there's really such an impetus, such an urgency, isn't there, for President Trump and the administration to really get something done here, not least of all for the economic reasons and all the pressure that they're under.
I do think there's a lot of people within the party who are facing elections or facing constituents that are having just gone to the petrol pump perhaps and are alarmed at those prices and when they might start to come down.
Most Americans really do feel the economic pain, and not only at the gas pump, but also, at grocery stores right now.
Well, here we are, another episode of The President's Path. And Bernd, you and I are delighted, aren't we, to welcome our friend Finn Gomez back to us. Finn, of course, is the CBS News political director, the executive director leading the political and White House coverage at CBS. Finn, great to have you with us once again. You were at the Emmy Awards this week in New York celebrating journalism, whatever there is left to celebrate at this point.
Yeah, it was great to celebrate the First Amendment and journalism and some of our great journalists at CBS, including our great immigration correspondent Camilo Montoya Galvez, he was up for an award for just barely missed out, but he's one to watch in our shop. So, but it was great it was a great event.
And I'll just I'll do the humble brag for the BBC as well and say that
Yes,
we
of
also won
course.
an Emmy there
Of course.
for outstanding
Yes.
continuing coverage in the short form category. So well done to all of
Great
our
event.
team. Because it's a busy old time to be a journalist, isn't it? I mean, this week we've spent all week talking about a deal that's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, it's on. Starting really last weekend with President Trump saying there was this deal imminent in terms of continuing the ceasefire between the US and Iran. And we had plenty of chat on that through the week. But there's really such an impetus, such an urgency, isn't there, for President Trump and the administration to really get something done here, not least of all for the economic reasons and all the pressure that they're under.
I think time is really kind of running out for them to address those issues ahead of the midterms. President Trump keeps saying in the Oval Office and when he's with press that he's not really concerned about the economic aspects of this war here domestically. He thinks it's kind of a price Americans are willing to pay for Iran not having a nuclear weapon. But I do think there's a lot of people within the party who are facing elections or facing constituents that are having just gone to the petrol pump perhaps and are alarmed at those prices and when they might start to come down. I think it's really kind of become a huge challenge since the beginning of this war.
Over the last week or so, you have seen some very bad poll numbers for the president. Just you've seen at least at least three that I saw. His approval ratings in the 30s. It's a bad place to be in right now. Republicans feel it. We're going through the primary part of this midterm cycle, but soon we'll be in the general election phase. And I think when that happens, I think these hurdles that Republicans have to face are directly tied to the president's performance. So if this deal comes together and is truly finalized here, and gas prices improve, this could end up a big political win for the president because there's still enough time in this early spring phase for Republicans to potentially rebound. But this all has to really come together because, again, most Americans really do feel the economic pain, and not only at the gas pump, but also, at grocery stores right now.
That timing point is a really important one, isn't it? Because when you speak to those who are expert in energy markets and so on, they say if a permanent deal, so not what we've been looking at this week, which is sort of a deal to get talks going on a permanent deal, but if a permanent deal was agreed, that it would still take months and months and months for that to be reflected in the prices at the petrol pump. So at what point does the president run out of road? And I mean, Bernd, you mentioned it there, the comment that he repeated this week about, oh, I'm not focused on the midterms. I'm not focused on Americans' personal economies. I'm focused on making sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. He got into a lot of trouble for saying that last week, and he said it again this week.
It's interesting too. I mean, he keeps saying that, but at the same time, we've seen, as we discussed last week on this podcast, I mean, we've seen him weigh in on primaries quite a lot, which he's kind of declared as a huge victory, and people point to that, saying he still has enormous sway with Republicans. But of course, the primaries is a very narrow segment of Republican voters, and the situation becomes much more complicated when you take in Democrats or people who are undecided. Then the economic question becomes much more kind of hugely important for him. And, also I think this deal, I mean, it would essentially be a deal to later talk about a deal. I mean, any deal on the nuclear issue, for example, I mean, when Obama dealt with the Iranian side, that took 20 months. That's a very technical discussion that needs to be had. And it's not one that can be had very quickly.
There has to be any sort of turnaround at this point. When you're talking about, timing here, it is still early. We're about 5-6 months away from the midterm elections, but it has to be something significant. If there is a deal and there's no real, or there's a prolonged delayed effect at the gas pump, then that political advantage will not be implemented. People have to feel that it's improving, that their pocketbook issues are being addressed, right? So that's the thing. There's a really tough climate right now for Republicans. At the same time, most voters aren't necessarily saying, okay, I'm voting for Democrats either. There's this anti-establishment sort of fervor that we're seeing really across the political landscape this year, which is getting really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of continuing on from what we've seen in the last few years, isn't it? Anti-establishment, anti-elites, anti-authority, anti-expertise, and people, trusting sort of their neighbors or their friends or some random person they see on their social media feed ahead of all these facts and figures and statistics. But speaking of facts and figures and statistics, I had a look at some of those latest sort of financial markers that were out this week. Inflation is now at the highest rate it's been in almost 3 years. I mean, that was the single big thing that Donald Trump was really using to sort of bash Joe Biden with, wasn't it, in the 2024 campaign? It's up at 3.8%. When Donald Trump came into office, it was at 2.6%. So a big jump there. We're talking about gas prices, petrol prices. If you look at the start of the war, they were $3.76 a gallon. They're now $5.55 a gallon. That's the average price. Obviously, it's way higher in some other places. My local petrol station I drove by, it's nearly $7 a gallon. Like, it's crazy. And at some point, I mean, we're seeing it in the polls, Finn, already, aren't we? That people are now saying, I'm feeling the pain of this.
We're seeing that economic pain again. It's, to borrow a phrase from James Carville, 1990s style. He famously came up with the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." It's affordability, stupid, in 2026. Right? It is the simple issue across demographics is our cost of living issues, pocketbook issues, and you're seeing that. You're seeing that bleed into Trump's pillars from his 2024 coalition. You're seeing it with Latino voters who did vote in historic numbers for him. Also, you're seeing it with independents and also young voters. They're seeing the shift back. So that's if you're a Republican, that's troubling. But you're also seeing the road in some of these polls just this past week with Republican supporters. And that's when it's like you see that it's a pattern. And so I think they're trying to pivot and address that again in an earlier stage of this race.
I think about the Republican voters. I think it's really interesting, and it's not discussed as often as petrol prices, but fertilizer prices have gone up as well.
Yep.
And for farmers, that's a huge expense. And the Republican Party has generally and historically seen farmers as kind of a rather solid voting bloc. It was interesting. I was speaking to someone who lives in Iowa this week, longtime Trump supporter. I mean, the price of fertilizer itself is kind of putting him off from President Trump. And that's not to say he's going to vote Democrat. He never will. But I think there's that level of exasperation within kind of what is seen as generally leaning towards the MAGA bloc of the Republican Party.
I mean, Iowa is in play this year. there's a Senate race that's happening there right now, and a gubernatorial race where the Democrats there, you look at the most polling, they're looking pretty strong. And for some Democrats, many Democrats, they see those, oh, that could be a place that we could flip potentially. And a big part of that is like what Bernie talked about. Uh, it's not just the gas prices, the rise in petrol prices. It's tariffs. It's the whole beef back and
Mm.
forth, right? Like
Oh,
they're
beef is
feeling
huge. Yeah.
in workforce issues, right? With some of the migrant workforce that they utilize there too. There's all these things that are kind of developing out there.
What I'm going to be watching for as well, though, is the sofa. Like, how many people, to your point, Bernie, like that farmer who thinking, I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump, but I'm not going to vote for the, the Donald Trump backed candidate or the Republican candidate, but I'm not going to vote for the Democrat either. And who can get voters to the polls in greater numbers? I was speaking to someone in Pennsylvania. They're saying we're really leaning into the mail-in balloting, even if it's not the president's favorite thing to do, because we see that Democrats get a lot of votes that way, early, reliable. And it'll come into a factor, I think, down in Texas, a big race we were all focused on earlier in the week now that we have, James Tallarico knows who he's facing.
Yeah.
He's facing Ken Paxton. And that's going to be a really big one about who can get more people actually out to vote when midterms traditionally aren't as exciting for lots of people. They're not trying to decide on a president. It's one that you kind of maybe think you'll take a pass on and not cast your vote.
Yeah, this is turning into a marquee race. It's really fascinating. Even a few months ago, look, Democrats need 4 seats to flip to take back the Senate. Uh, for most of this cycle, it wasn't even like a possibility, and then it's sort of changed because the climate has changed. But still, most Democrats are targeting Maine. They're targeting Ohio, even Iowa, Michigan, places like that, Alaska. Texas was sort of like a pipe dream, as we know. But this time around, and because of this matchup between Ken Paxton and James Tallarico, Paxton has some political baggage and some previous investigations. He was impeached by the Texas State House, acquitted later by the Texas State Senate. But they have their best. Democrats believe they have their best matchup in years, and they feel because of the climate, they have a real chance to win there. Um, so it kind of like it sort of enhances and improves the map for Democrats potentially, but so it's getting very interesting race there.
I think ultimately that's end up going to be kind of an ugly race as well. I mean, just in the first few days after Paxton essentially secured his run, you started to see him and some White House officials, for example, frame Tallarico as kind of being the caricature of what they see as a certain generation of woke leftist politicians. But I mean, ultimately in the election in November, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how much that message takes over the economic message. I mean, I think that's kind of a messaging test for future elections also. I mean, social issues, while they're very important to a lot of people, I mean, polls almost uniformly say they're not really even close to being the most important issue for the average American voter.
And just a few more stats that I was referencing earlier. The CEO confidence rating was out this week as well for the second kind of quarter of the year, and it's gone from being 59% confidence that CEOs to have in the economy to 47. So this is a big drop in confidence from the types of people that Donald Trump likes to hang out with, whose opinions he listens to, and sort of takes caution about what they say. Also, we've seen that earnings are down for Americans, like wages are down and savings are down as well. So people are starting to maybe chip into their rainy day fund. If inflation is going up and your comparative, affordability, your wages compared to that inflation are not matching it in any way, and in actual fact are going in the other direction, then the pain and the pinch is going to become greater and greater. But I wonder to what extent, we've talked about how impactful all of that is. But if we were to see the war in Iran become kinetic, to use the word of the year, and to become hot again, does that impact how people in some of those key districts you're talking about vote? Because again, we've come back to it time and time again about how Donald Trump campaigned on not getting into forever wars. This war in Iran started as being just a multi-day, was the expression he was using. Then it became a few weeks. Then it became a few months. During the cabinet meeting this week, he was starting to talk about it in terms of other wars like Vietnam and Afghanistan that lasted for years and years. And you're kind of thinking, is he laying the ground here for an involvement that may be a lot longer than was first anticipated?
I think the war, if it continues, will be a major political obstacle for the president and his Republican allies. Look, you even see in our polling, it shows that yes, his base is very supportive of him, but it sort of goes against their sort of MAGA dogma of America first, right? And the more prolonged it goes, and then again, if it still has those effects on the cost of living issues like gas prices, and something they touted so recently, it could really do damage. And I think that will be it will not only hurt those other voting groups like independents, but also his base voters. At a certain point, they're going to want to turn that around.
And I think even more broadly, I mean, looking when they announced the Pentagon budget, the record-setting Pentagon budget, you saw that come at the expense of some domestic programs, and one would imagine the Democrats are going to point to something like that and say, how can this be America first, to try strip some of those people that are feeling conflicted away about it. But at the same time, I think many of the president's supporters, they really do believe this peace through strength mantra that President Trump repeats quite often. I mean, especially if it seems that any negotiation with Iran, leads to them not having a nuclear weapon or giving away its capacity to build a nuclear weapon in the future. I think a lot of the president's supporters will point to that and say, this was a relatively cheap investment for a long-term goal. I think you've already heard people say similar about Venezuela, that a quick operation, and now Venezuela is again in play for the U.S. economically.
Except obviously, as we've talked about so many times before, Venezuela and Iran are just completely different, aren't they, in terms of, their relationship to the US and so on. But on the military point as well, I always wonder, there's that forever war aspect, but there's also the fact that the military is a major employer in this country. If we're talking about Texas, so many big bases there, for example. People of a certain generation have a fear about their children who are active duty and where they're being sent to, and what might happen there. And I think the Republican Party, through what the president and Secretary Hegseth have been doing about sort of trying to build up, surging the force and the number of people who are signed up to the military, gets some support in one level, but maybe that's taken away then when you factor in the risk factor of potentially putting US military lives on the line.
Yeah, I don't think there's much appetite within the Republican Party for boots on the ground or troops. I think there really isn't. Again, it feels that there's a sense there's a limit to their support, and I think that's sort of the red line for them. That was part of the impetus behind the rise of President Trump in 2016, and again his comeback in 24, was that he was not going to do nation building. He was not going to be a president who would have more of a isolationist sort of perspective, I think. And I think that really resonated with a lot of his base voters, a lot of sort of that middle class to working class section of the electorate whose sons and fathers had fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan. There's like the appetite there is not it's not as deep. So the longer it goes, it will become an issue for this president and his administration, and the Republican candidates who are looking to win in November.
And I think that's kind of really deeply influenced his foreign policy. The problem is it doesn't always necessarily work. I think clearly his always preferred option, whether it be in Venezuela, in Iran, potentially in Cuba, is to kind of replace the state without actually replacing the infrastructure and the mechanisms of the state. I think that's almost directly because of the U.S. experience in Iraq in 2003, having to replace the Iraqi
Yeah.
government. That's not something that President Trump wants to repeat. And that's something that voters almost certainly don't want the U.S. to repeat. I think it's just become difficult for him because that doesn't necessarily work everywhere. Cuba and Iran, as you said, Katrina, they're not the same as Venezuela. The situation domestically is
Yeah.
completely different in all three of them.
And when we're talking about Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran, there, obviously two of the three there are very important to one person in the cabinet. Not that they aren't to everyone, but to the US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio. To what extent are we seeing him really kind of coming into the fore in the last few weeks here in terms of swaying the policy, swaying the decisions, swaying the direction that this administration is going in, do you think?
Yeah, I think the Marco Rubio, who was a one-time rival of the president. We remember 2016 during that cycle. They had at times very ugly exchanges back and forth, but ultimately, he went from that point in the narrative to now being one of his most trusted advisors, especially on foreign policy, obviously, but one of the most popular figures within his cabinet. He has been talked about it at 2028 as a potential 2028 aspirant. He is someone who is very fluent. I've been covering him since 2007, when he endorsed Mike Huckabee in the 2008 presidential cycle, and he did it at Versailles, that iconic place in the this Cuban restaurant in Miami. And I remember recalling, Katrina, like this guy is this guy's a political athlete. He's very fluent in English and in Spanish. And then, of course, he ran 2010 and won then in that big upset to become senator and so forth. But I think right now, and you're seeing in some of the polling as well, yes, 26 is coming up, but people I know that are close to Marco Rubio have been urging him to reconsider a potential run for 2028. So it's so far he's close to JD Vance, sort of complicates things, but there has been more of an internal push within the party for him to potentially consider a White House run.
I think for a lot of voters, particularly Latino voters in Florida, I mean, he's been just the language he used is something that really resonates with a lot of voters in South Florida because his experience is essentially their experience. And when he talks about the threat of the Communist Party in Cuba, for example, that's something that many people in that part of the country will have been hearing from their parents and their grandparents for quite a lot of time now. And I think that's really resonated. And I mean, that's why, after the Raul Castro indictment, for example, just the level of affection I heard from people in Florida towards Marco Rubio, I thought was interesting. I'm just not sure necessarily that can be replicated nationally, in what is relatively short time.
Yeah, but if they do pull off this sort of, trifecta of Iran, of Cuba, let's say, and Venezuela, if they land in a place that is palatable to his base and externally, like that would be a pretty significant win for them, especially within their party. So that is, if it shakes out that way, that could resonate.
We will have to leave it there for today. Finn, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you. And you, as always, Bernie, great to see you as well. And talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, guys. Always a pleasure, Finn.
Thanks, guys. Love this podcast.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.